What's up, Bible Boot Camp? This is your weekly look at the world's greatest book written by the world's greatest author. This week we got Revelation chapter 6, Tribulation, 7 seals, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It's a jam-packed session with 3 main goals. 1. What is the purpose of the opening of the seals? 2. What should be our response to all this? And 3. What happens when it's opened? So before we get into all of that, since we are dealing with things that are not past events, and not really present events. These are events yet to happen. This all goes into kind of your theory of interpretation, your view on Bible prophecy. So because of that, kind of as is our custom, let's begin with the Berean principle, which basically says the people of Berea were listening to Paul and Silas, and they, A, were open-minded, B, they listened eagerly, but most importantly, C, they went and searched the scriptures to see if Paul and Silas were teaching the truth. And that's basically what I want to do with this jam-packed session. I am making a presentation. I want to put it out there for you. I want to get your mind spinning. I want to get your juices flowing. But then you go search the scriptures to see if I'm telling the truth. And by the way, like, you shouldn't believe anything I say, but you also shouldn't believe your pastor. You shouldn't believe your Sunday school teacher. You shouldn't believe your community group leader. Do what the Bereans did. You know, come in with an open mind, listen eagerly, but then you got to do your own study and let the Holy Spirit do its work in your life. Okay, so a little recap of where we've been in case you're just jumping in with us. We're doing a journey through the book of Revelation. It is the most unique book in the Bible. It's the only book of the Bible that comes with its own outline to the book. Jesus Christ in Revelation 1:19 outlines the 3 sections of the book. He tells John, write therefore what you have seen, write the things which are, and then write the things which shall take place later. And this sections off the 3 parts of the book of Revelation. In chapter 1, he saw the vision of Jesus Christ. Then in chapter 2 and 3, he has him write the things which are then presently the 7 letters to 7 churches. And then from chapter 4 on, he's going to have him write the things which shall take place later, or what follows after the churches. And that's the section that we're in right now. And like I mentioned several times, chapter 1 through 3 is the most important part of the book of Revelation for the church. Chapter 4 on, drama, suspense, all that stuff, we're going to cover it. But really, chapters 2 and 3 in particular, Jesus' 7 letters to 7 churches, is the most important and the most rewarding part of the book for you. But then after the 7 letters, the scene really starts to shift, and beginning in chapter 4, John gets caught up to the throne room of heaven, and it's there in verse 1 of chapter 4 that many people see as the rapture. He says, after this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven, and the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. This verse begins and ends. It's bookended by this term, metatauta, after this or after these things. After what things? After the 7 letters to 7 churches. So many people see this as the representation of the rapture. Now, while John is there, he will give a description of the throne room of heaven. And what is fascinating is when you look back at the tabernacle, yes, that tabernacle, when God sent Moses down from the top of Mount Sinai, he sent with him a lot of things, one of which was blueprints, basically, to a portable model of the throne room of heaven. And you'll see as John gives this description of the throne room that this right here, the tabernacle, was essentially a replica, a model of the throne room of heaven. And you can go through and study all of this, from the altar of sacrifice, the laver, the holy place, the 7 candlesticks, all those things that he describes and others is representative in this model on earth of the very throne room. Now, in his description of the throne room, he also describes seeing 1, angels, also a group called the 4 living creatures, and then this mysterious group known as the 24 elders. It says, surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. Now, this is very interesting to us. Who are the 24 elders? Now, we've done this kind of exploration of Revelation. You know, the scene shifts back and forth. You have events happening on earth. You also have events happening in heaven. And as we go back and forth from heaven to earth, one of the big questions through this is, where are believers? Where is the church at? We know in chapters 1 through 3, the church was on the earth. Where is the church at when we shift to chapter 4 on? And if they're not in heaven in chapter 4, when do they get to heaven? So that's kind of the ones that's most, applicable to us. And that set the stage for chapter 5 last week, the Lamb and the Scroll. John says, "Then I saw on the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides," which turns out to be very important, "and sealed 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?'" One of the things we learned about in the New Testament is everything in the Old Testament was written for the church. Paul says all these things were written aforetime for your learning and understanding. All those Old Testament stories are not just random stories. They're written for the wisdom, knowledge, and understanding of the body of Christ. And we get this example with the scroll back in Jeremiah 32. Jeremiah is in prison. God's about to wipe out the nation of Israel. Before he does so, he wants Jeremiah to buy up some land. The whole story deals with the purchase of land for future redemption. Even though Jeremiah would never return, it was God's promise that the land would be returned to them. And in this example, we have the scroll, which turns out to be a title deed to the earth. But the question from the angel is, who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll? It says, "But no man in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it. Then I began to weep bitterly because no man was found worthy to open the scroll or even look inside it. It had to be a man, and it had to be a kinsman of Adam." So what you have here is there is a sealed scroll in the right hand of God in heaven. A man has to open it, must be a kinsman of Adam, must meet the qualifications for that. And this is a title deed to the earth that Adam lost and Jesus Christ has purchased. And this comes down to this concept of what's called a kinsman redeemer. And you learn about this in the Old Testament also through the book of Ruth. Book of Ruth is so undervalued. It's a popular book, but what most people don't realize, it's one of the greatest books of prophecy and probably the most important book in the Old Testament for the church. What you have here is Naomi, who's a Jew, kind of represents the nation of Israel. She will be exiled from the land just like Israel will. You have Ruth, who is a Gentile, who has no access to God or the land. You have Boaz, who, by the way, is a Jew, and he will redeem both Naomi / Israel and Ruth, the Gentiles, through grace. And you learn about in the book of Ruth 2 really foundational laws. One's called the law of redemption. Naomi / Israel will gain access back to the land. And this law of Levirate marriage, Ruth, who's the Gentile, will gain her own redemption and salvation through the kinsman redeemer Boaz. And so when you take this kind of 3D look at the book of Ruth, here's what you come away with. In order to bring Ruth to Naomi, Naomi had to be exiled from her land just like Israel had to be. What the law could not do, grace did. Ruth has no chance, no access to God or the land, but it's through Boaz's extension of grace. What the law couldn't do, grace did, which is the same thing that's happened with the church. Ruth does not replace Naomi, just like the church does not replace Israel. Ruth learns of Boaz's ways through Naomi, just like Gentiles learned of Jesus Christ through Israel. Naomi meets Boaz through Ruth. And could it be that Israel, who knows of Jesus Christ, will actually know Jesus Christ through the church? And no matter how much Boaz loved Ruth, he had to wait until Ruth made the first move. It's kind of each of these kind of play their role, and it's very prophetic of what happens with Israel and the church. And then in verse 7, talking about the Lamb, says, "He came and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures of the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song. Thou art worthy to take the book," talking about the Lamb, "and to open the seals thereof. For thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by the blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth." And that is the verse we talked about last week. This is the 24 elders talking about, you've redeemed us, you have made us kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. Which brings us back to the identity of these 24 elders. And if you're asking, why is this so important? Because the 24 elders are already there in heaven prior to the tribulation. When Jesus opens these seals, the wrath of God will begin here on earth. That will be the tribulation period. The tribulation can't begin until the seals are broken. The seals can't be broken until the Lamb takes the book. The Lamb can't take the book until the 24 elders lay down their crowns. And then verse 11, "Then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands, and then 1,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the 24 elders. Now, all that is a warm-up / recap of where we've been. That brings us to where we are right now. Jesus has the scroll. He's going to start opening up each of those 7 seals. Every time he opens a seal, it's going to trigger an event here on earth. We call this the tribulation, and it's going to cover Revelation 6 through 19. Now, if you want a one-verse summary of those 14 chapters, Revelation 6 through 19, you can find it. It's in the Bible. It's in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. This is known as the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel. It covers 4 verses. And basically, verse 24 is an overview of these 70 weeks of years. Then in verse 25, it describes the first 69 weeks of years. Verse 27 describes the 70th or last week of years. And then in verse 26, you have this interval period. This describes events that happen after the 69 weeks, but before the 70th week. That is what's known as the church period. And to look at it with a different perspective, we have essentially the first 69 weeks of years. Then we have this interval period, which has been going on for at least 2,000 years. We have the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. We have the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and the clock has been ticking, and it's going to continue to tick until Romans 11:25 happens, which essentially is the fullness of the Gentiles. God already knows every person who was saved in the past, the present, and in the future. And when that full number is reached, the Father will turn to the Son and say, go get them. When that happens, that's going to trigger the 70th and final week of the nation of Israel. You got a 7-year period, which is going to be characterized by some kind of covenant being enforced by a coming world leader. At the halfway mark of that 7 years, there's going to be an event that Jesus talks about called the abomination of desolation. And essentially, you have 2 3.5-year period of time. 3.5 years, it's also known as 42 months, also known as 1260 days, the second half of which is known as the Great Tribulation, or as it was referred to in the Old Testament, as the time of Jacob's trouble. And so the 69 weeks is in verse 25, the church age in verse 26, and verse 27 is going to represent the 70th week, and we will cover it in detail in Revelation 6 through 19. Hope that makes sense. And at the end of that, if you're following along on the timeline, will be the second coming of Jesus at the end of that 70th week, that 7-year period. That will usher in the millennial reign, and on it goes. Now, before we read chapter 6, and I promise we're going to get there, I'm trying to set all this up for you. I want this to make sense. One of the goals for tonight was, what is the purpose of the tribulation? We're going to answer that. I want you to go back to Luke chapter 4 first. This is Jesus announcing his ministry. It says, he went to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And that's where he's going to stop. But I want you to just take a little mental note where he stopped at. He stops at a comma. We're going to talk about that comma here in just a second. But that's what he read from the book of Isaiah. And then it says, and he closed the book and gave it again to the minister and sat down. And the eyes of all them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, this day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears. Okay, so why did he stop at a comma? I want to show you why. Go back to Isaiah. This is what he was reading from. Chapter 61, verse 1 and 2. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, comma, and the day of vengeance of our God. And I want you to notice, that's where he stopped, right there in the synagogue of Nazareth. He stopped at that comma. What did he leave off? And the day of vengeance of our God. What he told them was, this part right here has been fulfilled, all of that. We, you and I, are in that comma, because the day of vengeance of the Lord has not happened yet. It's coming in our future. That comma has lasted 2,000 years. All that, until then, he's fulfilled. He hasn't fulfilled the day of vengeance. And just to understand this a little more fully, Hosea 5:15 gives you more of this purpose of the tribulation. This is God speaking. It says, I will go and return to my place. Till they acknowledge their offense and seek my face. In their affliction, they will seek me earnestly. I will go. This is God speaking. He will go and return. That means he had to leave. Till they, who's they? The nation of Israel. Until they, Israel, acknowledge their offense. What is their offense? What did they do wrong? They denied the Messiah. They denied Jesus. And he told them in Luke 19, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Jesus held them responsible for not recognizing who he was. There's hundreds of prophecies that they had studied about who would be the Messiah, where he would be from, when he would arrive, how he would arrive, on what day he would arrive, and he held them responsible. And he told them, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. But then he goes on and says, till they acknowledge their offense and seek my face, in their affliction, they will seek me earnestly. This affliction is what's known as in the Old Testament, the time of Jacob's trouble, and what Jesus referred to in the New Testament as the Great Tribulation. The purpose of the tribulation in part is to push the nation of Israel to the breaking point so that they do exactly this. In their affliction, they will seek me earnestly. So I hope that kind of makes sense in terms of like, yes, there is God's wrath upon the earth, but it's also Israel's in view too here. And that brings us to chapter 6, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Verse 1, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. Then I heard one of the four living creatures say in a voice like thunder, come. A couple things about this verse. Number one, notice it says, I watched. You know, John is not having some kind of dream here. He's not having a vision or hallucination. John is watching what is taking place. He's been describing the throne room, but now he's going to watch what's going to be happening on earth. The other thing is, it says the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. I mean, I know you get this, but just to make sure, this is Jesus. Jesus Christ is going to open these seals, and every time he opens one of those seals, it's going to trigger an event on earth. So we've got some simultaneous events happening, heaven and earth. The other thing about this verse is, it talks about the four living creatures saying a voice like thunder, come. The word in the Greek means to proceed or follow after. So I don't know the layout. I haven't been to the throne room, but here's John. He's been in the throne room describing everything, but now they're telling him, follow over here, come over here, because he's going to be able to witness the results of those seals being opened, of what's going to happen on earth, and he's going to watch it. And that brings us to this first seal. It's going to be the white horse, and this horse is going to be described as conquering. It says, verse 2, I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. You know, I don't know the percentage, but there's a large number of people, pastors, preachers, teachers, Bible scholars, commentators, that see this white horse right now as being Jesus Christ. And I think if you study this, the white horse that comes in Revelation 19, that's Jesus Christ. This is not. This is someone that appears as him. He is wearing a white horse. He is a white horse, and he's wearing a crown, but he holds a bow. A couple things about this. Obviously, bow, the word in the Greek toxon could be dart, arrow, sword. So you could be thinking he's got some kind of weapon, and that might be the case. But let me give you a different perspective on this. One thing about the word bow was the symbol of Nimrod the hunter. If you're not familiar with this, this goes all the way back to Genesis. This is the very first Antichrist, meaning he was the first world ruler. He was a one world leader. They had a one world religion and a one world economy, and he was this prototype to what's going to be the final Antichrist. Matter of fact, the final Antichrist is kind of the second Nimrod. So you've got that, and his symbol, the original Nimrod, was a bow. So this Antichrist also comes carrying a bow. So you could think there's some kind of connection there. Let me give you another perspective, though, that's totally different. This word bow is used once before in the Bible, and it's used in Genesis 9 When God says, I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. The bow, we know it as the rainbow. This was a covenant between God and the earth. That's what that is as you study it. I bring that up because this is the other time this word bow is used. A covenant. Now, let me take that a step further. In Daniel chapter 8, Gabriel is giving Daniel a prophecy of the end times. And he's going to tell him about this one world leader that's coming, this Antichrist. Here's what he says about him. And through his policy, also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart. And how shall he destroy many? By peace, not by war. By peace he shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against who? The prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Two things you get from this. This guy, this Antichrist, is not coming as a military general or a warrior or something like that. He's coming, he's going to enforce a covenant. We're going to talk about that. A covenant of peace. He's going to bring international peace. And he's going to stand up against the prince of princes. He's going to be the anti-Jesus Christ, which is why he's referred to as the Antichrist. Daniel gets another prophecy in chapter 9, though, still talking about the Antichrist. In this one, it says, and he, again, talking about the Antichrist, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Number one, this is this covenant he's going to enforce. It's going to be a peaceful one. And how long is the covenant going to be? For 1 week of years. This is Daniel's 70th week prophecy, and it's 1 week of years, so it's 7 years. He's going to confirm or enforce this covenant. But in the midst of the week, that's the halfway mark, that's the 3.5 years, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolation. What that means, basically, I'll sum it up like this, because there's a lot in that verse. Jesus talks about, in the Olivet Discourse, talks about the wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be an event called the abomination of desolation that happens in the holy place, in the temple. That's what this verse is talking about. This abomination of desolation. It's going to happen at the middle of that 7 week, and it's going to come because he's going to enforce a covenant of peace, but he's going to break it at the halfway mark. That's what it is. And I just bring this up because this Antichrist, this is one of his characteristics. He's going to bring international peace. And so I think going back to this bow could be some kind of weapon, but it could also be what God originally did with setting up a covenant between him and the earth. So something to consider. All right, so that is, we're going to have these 4 horsemen, and we're going to have these 4 seals, but the first one, actually going to have 7 seals, but 4 of them is going to be the 4 horsemen. But the first one is the white one, comes conquering. Okay, let's get to this second seal. This is the red horse. This one is not going to bring peace, it's going to bring war. It says, verse 3, when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. So this seal, when broken, is not bringing peace. It is going to take peace and bring war. And it's interesting when you think about 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Here's what's going on. Paul's talking about this. He's talking about the end times. He's talking about the Antichrist. And the warning is, when people are saying peace and safety, peace and safety, peace and safety, destruction will come upon them. And that's talking about this period of time right here. All right, so that's the second horse. That brings us to this third one, the black horse, which will bring famine. So we've got peace, we've got war, now we're bringing famine as kind of the collateral damage. Verse 5, when the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come. I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. The black horse, verse 6, then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures. And by the way, I probably should mention this. Notice that there's 4 living creatures, and each one will announce one of the 4 horsemen. It's a different one for each one. Says this one, then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and wine. A couple of things about this. This 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages. What this means is, or this 3 loaves of barley, it could be also referred to as, it implies a massive global recession. We're not just talking about inflation, we're talking about hyperflation. So much so, the 3 quarts of barley for a day's wage means you will work an entire day just for bread for you. You got a family of 4 or 5, you're in big trouble. But it's going to take an entire day's wages just to buy up bread. And just give you a real world example, go back and study the Weimar Republic in Germany, early 1920s. There was a period of time, I think in 1922, first week in June, an egg was roughly the amount of like 10 cents, 10 cents for an egg. Inflation rose at 41% per day, so that after a month, that one egg went from 10 cents to $4,000 per egg. See what I'm saying? Milk, bread, everything went hyperflation, and it happened like that. So much so that the paper, it costs more to print the paper than what the actual German mark was worth. And there's horror stories about they were no longer counting paper money by paper, they were counting it in bundles. And it just, honestly, in this case right here, you've got an entire day's wage for just something as simple as bread or an egg. The other thing about this verse, though, what's it say? And all, by the way, I should mention, this also implies controlled rationing. Food is scarce and there's rationing. The other thing is, don't damage the oil and wine. Think about the olive oil and the wine as our equivalent to health and beauty aids. And in this case, the Antichrist is going to control the world's economy. What you get from this verse is hyperflation. It's too expensive to even buy milk. However, the rich still have access to health and beauty aids. The rich are going to get richer and the poor is going to get poorer. And that's what's happening here as a result of the covenant of peace that was broken, then the war, and now famine. But it's going to get worse. That's 3 of the horsemen. This 4th one is the pale horse, and it will ultimately bring death. Verse 7, when the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, come. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. And the word we get is chloros. It could, it's where we get the word chlorine. But you get the picture about this livid or pale horse. It says his rider was named Death, and hell was following close behind him. So there's 2 of them, death and hell. That's part of the problem I have with this white horse being Jesus Christ, because he is hanging out with the wrong crowd, if that's him. It says they were given power over a 4th of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. What's interesting is a 4th of the earth, that's about how much land mass we have. So could it be something with that? And the other thing about this, beasts of the earth. Okay, so we're talking about death. When we think of beast, we think about some wild creature, right? The actual word here is therion in the Greek. That's what's used. We translate it into English as beast. It's probably not the most awesome of translation, but let me give you an example of this. So this therion, beast, could be a monstrous creature. And I just use Godzilla as an example, okay? So it could be that. It could be like a wild beast that slaughters. But this therion could also mean microscopic. And some of the most deadly creatures on planet Earth are microscopic. So when we say beast that wipes out a 4th, may not be just a big gargantuan creature. Okay, so that is the 4 horsemen. You've got the white horse that comes conquering, red horse brings war, black horse brings famine, green horse brings death. Now, what I want to do is, there's 3 more seals. What we're going to do next week is, you hear these horses, these pale rider and the black horse. Next time, what I want to do is put this in a real world perspective. So next week, we're going to look at these 4 horsemen in a drastically different way, but in a real world perspective. And I think it's happening right now in front of your eyes. I'm going to call it the coming deception, or as I like to say, Satan's plot twist to fool the world, because that's what Jesus promised would happen. Jesus promised there would be false prophets, there would be false Christ, false messiahs. He promised it's going to happen. He promised the world would believe it. And I'm going to give you an example of how I think this is happening right now. I believe it is the great lie of our time. It's happening in our city right now. So we're going to talk about that. I also want you to complete the 4 horsemen worksheet. I'll post the link in the video description below, and get ready for next week. It's going to be interesting. Until then, always remember Romans 8:28.